Welcome back. So we're doing part 2 of the branches of government section of your listening and media analysis assessment. And here we are on Article 1 of the Constitution, which talks about the legislative branch of the Constitution. And you'll remember that the legislative branch has the job of making rules and laws, and then a few other jobs in addition. So here's some things that I want to mention about the legislative branch of the Constitution. First of all, the Constitution as originally written contained 4,400 words. More than half of them are included in Article 1. Why would that be? Well, first of all, the legislative branch is the one that's closest to the people. The voice of those closest to the people should be the strongest. Second, the framers of the Constitution had the model of English Parliament, so their ideas about good government came from the delegation of power back in England, and their ideas about how things should be different meant really that they should be different from England. So when they were limiting powers, they thought of themselves as limiting the power of a legislature. Finally, the Founding Fathers wanted to improve on both the Second Continental Congress and on Parliament. So, the legislative branch got the most attention. So let's talk about the first part of the legislature, which is Congress. So Congress has two parts because it's a bicameral house. Bicameral, again, meaning two houses. It has the House of Representatives and it has the Senate. Collectively, Congress and its associated organizations comprise the legislative branch. They make laws. Senators and representatives are referred to as congressmen and congresswomen. The Congress of the United States has particular powers, and these powers are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and it lists 27 particular powers, but we're not going to go through all of them because some of them are a little goofy, like Congress has the power to decide what the standard weights and measures are. That's neat. If you want to know all of that trivia, please read the Constitution for yourself. There's lots of stuff in there. But the big idea that you really want to get about the legislative power of the Constitution is that they have limited powers. There's only certain things that Congress is supposed to be making laws about. And those things do include things like the power to raise taxes, although there's some rules even in there about what kind of taxes they can raise. In addition, Congress has the power to make and approve the national budget, including the budget to fund the military. Congress also has the power to declare war. It has the power to coin money and to print paper money. It has the power to regulate foreign and domestic commerce. And, interestingly, it has the power to do anything, to make any law that is necessary and proper to carry out the other powers. So that necessary and proper clause is where sometimes Congress is able to do more than it seems like it can because it might need to make a law in order to enforce its other laws. The other place where Congress sometimes gets more power than one might expect is in the Commerce Clause. You see, the ability to regulate commerce between the states really means that almost any law that Congress wants to pass can exist because, for example, Congress might want to pass, say, a law mandating that every person buy health care, and it might not seem immediately like that has to do with commerce, but of course, health insurance is a business, and that business operates across multiple states, and so as a necessary and proper part of regulating that business, Congress is able to make a law through the Commerce Clause that seems a little bigger than what it's possible the framers intended. There are also a few limits on what Congress can do. One of those limits is that Congress is not allowed to pass what's called an ex post facto law, which is a law that deals with things that have already happened. So you can't say it is illegal to have once eaten a chocolate cake for your birthday and then go after all of the chocolate cake eaters. You can't make a law that says we're going to go after this one specific person or this one specific group. That's called a bill of attainder. They're not allowed to do that either. And Congress is also, and I think this is kind of wonderful, not allowed to grant any title of nobility in the United States. There's a few other restrictions as well. Again, I encourage you to look them up. But those are basically the powers of Congress. That's what Congress does. What is also true is that the House of Representatives has some particular powers that are unique to it. This, again, is part of that separation of powers that the Founding Fathers were so excited about. So the House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment. Impeachment is when you need to put a public official, not just the president, but any public official, on trial for committing some sort of crime. The House of Representatives is the group that can levy that accusation. The House also has the ability to start all revenue bills. And this is really important because spending money is one of those things that gets controversial, because if the government spends money, it has to raise money, which usually means taxes. When the Founding Fathers came up with the idea for the House of Representatives, they understood that the House would be the one that would employ more people who were a little bit closer to the common man, and so they thought, well, if that body thinks it's important to spend money, then it probably is at least reasonable to imagine that that's true. Whereas the Senate was seen as a little bit more elite, and so giving them the power of revenue seemed a little bit dangerous. Okay, some other features of the House of Representatives. First of all, there are 435 representatives. Originally, they were divided according to population, so there was one representative for every 30,000 people. But eventually they just fixed the number at 435, and now it's divided by population of each state as percentage of national population. The leader of the House is called the Speaker. The Speaker right now, in 2015, is Paul Ryan. And the Speaker of the House votes on every bill as a regular representative. The Speaker also has the ability to decide which bills come up for a vote. We'll talk a little bit later about how a bill becomes a law. But one of the important things about that process is that in order for a bill to become a law, the House of Representatives has to vote on it. In fact, so does the Senate. Let's talk about those guys. Like the House of Representatives, the Senate has some exclusive powers. So one of those is the power to try impeachments. The House of Representatives can levy an accusation against a public official like the president, but the Senate runs the trial. In addition, the Senate can approve treaties. They need a 2/3 vote to do that. They also can approve presidential appointments. So the president appoints people like Supreme Court justices and Secretary of State and the Attorney General and I don't know, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Senate gets to say whether or not they like the person the president has appointed. That's called the advised consent power. The Senate does not have the ability to originate bills that raise revenues, but they do have the ability to amend tax bills just like other legislation. So it isn't as though the Senate doesn't have anything to do with setting tax plans. Here's some other stuff having to do with the Senate. The Senate has 100 members right now because the Senate always gets 2 representatives from each state. So unlike the House of Representatives, the Senate is evenly distributed among states. So a state with a tiny population might actually only have 1 member in the House of Representatives, but would always have 2 senators. And a state might have 50 people in the House of Representatives because it has a huge population like California, but they would still only have 2 senators. The leader of the Senate is the vice president, who is president of the Senate, but president of the Senate is not really that big a deal. It just means that sometimes if the Senate ties 50-50, the vice president gets to cast a vote and break the deadlock. That's pretty much all I want to say about the Senate right now, although there will be more later. Okay, so now that we've gotten a taste of the House and the Senate, let's talk about a few more elements of those things. First of all, let's talk about length of term and term limits. Senators get to serve 6-year terms, and they're all staggered by 2 years. So every 2 years, a third of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election or could get voted out of office. Congressmen are always up for re-election every 2 years, so they move in and out more quickly. And the idea is, because the Senate has an international role, the senators have to stay longer so they can learn to do their jobs a little bit more effectively by the time they're done. What about elections? Well, senators and congressmen are both elected directly by the people in each state they represent. It used to be that senators were appointed by state legislatures, but that was done away with. In order to be in the Senate, you have to be 30 years old, you have to have been a citizen for 9 years, and you need to be a resident of the state from which you were chosen. In order to be a congressperson, you only have to be 25 years old, although there are not a lot of 25-year-old congresspeople. You need to have been a citizen for at least 7 years, and again, you have to be a resident of the state that you're chosen from. All right. Let's talk a little bit about something funky, which is the relationship between our legislative branch and the legislative branch back in England, which is the one that inspired ours. So that one was called Parliament. And the thing that you want to know is both our government and the English government have bicameral houses. What we have is the House and the Senate. What they had is the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So just like theirs, one of our houses is a little closer to the people. In our case, that's the House of Representatives. In their case, it's the House of Commons. And one's a little more removed. In our case, that's the Senate. And in their case, that's the House of Lords. But more importantly, how is this different from the Second Continental Congress, the group that had power under the Articles of Confederation? Well, first of all, the Second Continental Congress was a unicameral house. There's only one of them. And ours today is bicameral. There are 2 houses. Our Congress has way more power than the Second Continental Congress and doesn't require that 9 out of 13 majority that the Continental Congress needed. In addition, there are more representatives, and they're represented in different ways. But one of the other things that's really different is that within our Congress, there are checks and balances, because the Senate and the House of Representatives both have to work together effectively in order to, for example, impeach and remove a sitting president, or in order to pass a law. Remember that in order for any bill to become a law, both houses have to agree to it. So that's a majority of 535 people. All right, let's talk about another branch of government now. Now we're talking about the executive branch. When we talk about the executive branch, we're basically talking about the president. The president lives and works at the White House. And he walks up to the Hill to give an annual State of the Union address to Congress, the Supreme Court Justice, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the people. Remember, the president is basically an executive. That means it's the president's job to make decisions and do things, rather than make the rules that he or she is enforcing. It's useful to think of the executive branch as having 2 sets of powers. So one of them is the sort of foreign affairs set of powers, and one of them is the domestic affairs set of powers. Let's start with foreign affairs. The President of the United States is the commander-in-chief, which means that he or she is the highest-ranking officer in the armed services. The president outranks and can command any member of the armed services. The armed services are technically part of the executive branch in terms of organizational structure, but Congress does have the power to declare war. So if the president is using military force without a declaration of war, in theory, Congress should be able to eventually stop him or her if it goes on for too long. Having said that, if you study American history, what you'll find is that's been a sore spot between presidents and Congress forever. Presidents can also delegate day-to-day functions of the Army and military. They appoint the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which basically means the heads of all the branches of the military. Of course, again, they need congressional approval to do that. The president is also chief of state, which means the president is the biggest diplomat in the country. The president represents the country in international relations. The president can go himself or send an ambassador. Remember, the president appoints all of the ambassadors, which, again, the Senate has to approve. The president also appoints a Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State's job is to mostly handle all of that foreign affairs executive branch stuff. However, the Secretary of State is subject to congressional approval, and the Secretary of State has to report to the president. Finally, the president receives all diplomats from other countries, so there are big state dinners at the White House, which the president presides over. Oh, and one more thing. The president is the person who sets up treaties, and by the president, I mean the White House generally. But treaties have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate in order to go into effect. So, the president only has the power to set up treaties that the Senate will approve of. All right, well, now let's talk about the domestic powers of the president. The president is the chief executive, which means the president is the administrator of all of our laws. It's the president's job to make sure that laws, especially federal laws, are enforced. In fact, when the president takes office, he or she has to say, "I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Well, the president doesn't do that alone. In fact, there are 4 million employees of the executive branch, and all of those people are dedicated to making sure that the rules and laws of the federal government are enforced. In addition, the president is in charge of accepting or not accepting congressional bills. So, when Congress wants to pass a law, they first agree on it, vote on it, and when they've all agreed upon it, they present that bill to the president. And the president has the option of signing that bill and accepting that that's a law, or the president can veto the bill, which means they can say, "No, I don't want that to be a law." And at that point, Congress can either override the veto by passing the law again with a 2/3 majority in both houses, or the bill might just be dead. The other thing the president can do is this nifty thing called a pocket veto. And the way that works is if the president doesn't take any action for more than 10 days after a bill is passed by both houses of Congress, and Congress goes out of session while that's happening, then the bill just kind of goes away. And then Congress has to re-present it to the president in order for it to exist again. Of course, if Congress stays in session for all of that time, then the bill just automatically becomes law. So you want to be a little bit careful with that pocket veto. The other thing the president gets to do domestically, which is a huge deal, is that the president appoints all judges and officials. So one of those things is federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. Another thing that means is ambassadors. So that's all of our foreign relations. Another thing that means is all of the various members of what's called the president's cabinet. So that's the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War and the Attorney General and the Surgeon General and a lot of other people, all of whom Congress has to approve. But the point is that the president being in charge of that means that all of our laws and rules are being enforced by people that the president picks. And remember, there's a big difference between a president who wants to aggressively enforce, say, our drug laws and a president who wants to enforce those laws less aggressively. So that enforcement power does actually give the president quite a good deal of power over what happens in the United States. All right, now the good stuff. I know you all want to be president when you grow up, so here's what you have to do in order to pull that off. First of all, you have to get elected. And in order to get elected, you have to run. So you've got to be 35 years old, like me. You have to be a natural-born citizen, like me. You have to be elected by an electoral college. I admit I have not done that yet. But you do have to be willing to go through the election process. And that means that you run nationally, the citizens of each state vote, and what happens is if a majority of those citizens vote for a particular candidate, then that candidate will get all of the electoral votes in that state, except in a few states, but let's not worry about that right now. The electoral votes of a state come out to the number of members of the House of Representatives plus the number of senators that that state has. So every state is worth a certain number of, say, president points. And that means that it is theoretically possible for a person to win an election by getting more states, but not actually more votes than their opponent. This happened as recently as 2000 when Al Gore defeated George Bush in the vote count part of the election, but not in the electoral vote part of the election. And as a result, George Bush became president. One other thing, the president can be removed. So can the vice president. In fact, so can any public official. But they can only be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The president has to be impeached by the House and has to then be convicted by the Senate. This has only happened twice, and both times the president was acquitted. So once Andrew Johnson was the president after Lincoln, he got impeached and then acquitted, and the other was Bill Clinton in the 1990s. A question the Anti-Federalists asked, and a question that you might be asking is, wait, how is a president all that different from a king? Well, the answer is, a president is way different from a king. First of all, presidents serve 4-year terms rather than serving for life. They don't get their job because they're born that way. They have to get elected. And presidents are subject to checks on their power by the other branches of government. So presidents are in no way all-powerful. Having said that, presidents do have a great deal of power, including the power to launch gigantic and destructive wars. So we do want to be careful who we elect. All right, let's wind this puppy down with an examination of the judiciary branch. The U.S. judiciary, also called the Supreme Court, is the third branch of government. And basically, the judiciary runs on what's called a common law judicial system, which is based on the Constitution, laws passed by Congress, and precedent. So precedent is a new weird thing that I haven't told you about yet. Precedent is rulings in prior cases. Precedent is binding if a higher court has made the ruling, otherwise it's persuasive. So what that means is that when the Supreme Court makes a decision, that decision is binding on all other courts dealing with the same question, unless the Supreme Court decides to reverse itself. But lower courts, like state federal courts, are not supposed to overturn Supreme Court rulings. That's not how it works. The U.S. Supreme Court's decisions are the most final of any court in the land. This common law tradition is just like England's, and that is why they are both called common law systems. So, how does the Supreme Court system work in the United States? Well, the federal judiciary is separate from state judicial systems, except when state judicial rulings violate the Constitution. For example, Brown versus the Board of Education was found to violate the 14th Amendment. Another area might happen where federal law has exclusive jurisdiction. So, for example, drug trafficking is seen as a federal issue, so the Supreme Court gets to make rulings in those cases along with federal courts. Article 3 of the Constitution, though, which is the article that deals with the Supreme Court, is much shorter than Articles 1 and 2 because the judiciary doesn't really have to be described in the Constitution. The people who made the Constitution already understood how courts worked because there already was the English tradition of law to draw from. So basically, all Article 3 does is create a Supreme Court and inferior courts as Congress wants to establish, and that is all. No, I can hear you saying, tell me more about the Supreme Court. All right, fine. Here's a couple more things. There's 9 justices, which means there's 9 judges on the Supreme Court. The 9 judges have the power to overturn rulings by other people, and what's incredibly neat is that the rules for how you become a Supreme Court justice are shockingly arbitrary. Let's check them out. Supreme Court justices are set for life. That's because the framers of the Constitution thought if the justices had to be elected, they might become corrupt. So judges get to have their jobs for life until they decide to retire. They're appointed by the president with the confirmation of the Senate. But there's no age requirement or even citizenship requirement. The leader is the Chief Justice, who's one of the 9, but the Chief Justice doesn't have any more vote than anybody else. So, just to be clear, not only is the appointment to the Supreme Court for life, but you don't have to be a judge to get the job. You don't even have to be an adult to get the job. You could become a Supreme Court justice right now if you could get the president to appoint you and the Senate to confirm you, and of course, one of the current sitting justices retired. Good luck with that. This here is a chart. I have put it in this slideshow so that you can look at it. I'm just going to talk randomly for a little while you look at this chart. Really, the point of this is so that you can look at this information, which is kind of fun trivia. If you're bored of listening to me ramble, then just skip ahead.